Thank you, Brad. That was fantastic, and I do want to move right along to our main speaker, Barbara Elliott, who is scholar in residence and assistant professor in the Honors College of Houston Baptist University. She is the author of 5 books, including Street Saints, Renewing America's Cities. Barbara founded the Work Faith Connection, which has now transitioned more than 5,000 people from prison, homelessness, and unemployment into a new job and new life. Barbara also served President Ronald Reagan in the White House and then reported television news from Europe for PBS. Later, Barbara interviewed more than 100 people behind the Iron Curtain to find out what led to the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. Her book, Candles Behind the Wall, Heroes of the Peaceful Revolution That Shattered Communism, reveals that this was no ordinary revolution. And by the way, a new edition of Candles Behind the Wall will be coming out soon. And if you would like to sign up to be notified when the book is available, there's a form at our book table where you can put your name down and be notified. And also on your tables, there's a form. So you don't even have to go to the book table, and you'll be notified when Candles comes out in this great new edition. As the Berlin Wall fell, Barbara launched a private initiative to help people fleeing communism. For these efforts and her outreach to America's homeless, Barbara received the Eleanor Roosevelt Award for Human Rights from President George W. Bush in 2001. Please welcome Barbara Elliott.
Thank you, Steve, for that lovely introduction. He made it so complimentary because he still owes me for introducing to his wife. Got him a good one, too. And thank you, Winston, for having me here. It's kind of a risky thing putting your spouse on the program. Now, the reason he did that is not because he loves me, which he does, but because I was there when the Berlin Wall came down, and that 30th anniversary is something we celebrate this fall, and it's worth celebrating. It was an event that really changed the course of the 20th century, and it freed 400 million people, and scarcely a shot was fired. That is not a normal revolution. Now, we have a lot of students here this morning, which is wonderful, so I'm going to give you just a mini historical framework for my remarks, maybe for some of the rest of you guests too, who weren't alive then. Let me give you a very brief one. So, at the end of the Second World War, the Allied forces still had to administer the countries that the Nazis had taken over. So Russia was our ally, and the Central Eastern European countries were put under their control. They were supposed to give them free elections and transition them back into being free countries. Well, that did not happen. Russia simply grabbed them, imposed its totalitarian form of government on them, and snatched all of those hundreds of millions of people who basically lost the Second World War twice. Communism was deadly serious about crushing any opposition. To impose their ideology, the communists of the 20th century killed 200 million of their own civilians worldwide. Let me say that again. The communists in the 20th century worldwide killed 200 million of their own civilians to impose their ideology. They stripped away all the existing law, all the existing property rights, all the existing freedom of speech and religion, and they enforced a reign of terror. So that's the end of the history lesson. No quiz later, you're fine. So here's where my story intersects this story. Right after President Reagan was elected in 1980, he appointed me to the Office of Public Liaison, and it was an honor to serve him there. I later was in Europe, and I became a reporter for PBS television, reporting economic and political news. I was based in Germany, so as these events were going on in Germany, the Cold War was getting hot. We were stationing the Pershing missiles, NATO was, in response to the Soviet SS-20s that were aimed at European cities, and there was a lot of nervousness. So, as a television reporter, I could see the economic and the political considerations of all of these events because that's what we do. And that's the grid through which all news fits, right? Economics and politics. If it doesn't fit through that grid, it's not news. You can't even see it. Then something happened that changed me. In the summer of 1989, there was a huge wave of people who had come through somehow and gotten over to freedom in the western side. 300,000 of them had ended up in West Germany, and there were just too many people for the government, too many people for the Red Cross, just too many people. And there was not enough care for them. They put them in shelters everywhere. So I had been living in a world of political power and aristocracy. I was a baroness living in a villa, and I'm nobbing with diplomats and thinking I'm quite grand. Then I woke up one morning, I looked in the mirror and said, I don't even know who you are. I was a little rusty on praying, but I said, God, I've done it my way, and it looks good on the outside, but I know that my life has not yielded anything of any lasting value. And I said, if you can make my life a witness to you, please do. So he met me there, and he started remaking me. There was a lot of work to be done. I'm still a work in progress. But he began to show me that life could be different. I read a lot of scripture. I was discipled by some really wonderful women. So 2 years later, I'm all soaked in scripture. I'm all prayed up, and I'm saying, okay, Lord, now what do you want me to do? And he gave me an answer I was not expecting. Refugees. Refugees, I'm thinking. I don't know how to do refugees. I do dinner parties. I did not say that to God. So I obeyed. I went to shelters near us in Cologne, Germany, with one friend and began reaching out to the people there. I mean, there were people there who had dodged bullets, swum rivers, carried their children on their shoulders, and had gotten to freedom in the West. They needed doctors. They needed a place to live. They needed jobs. I tutored their children. I took a family home with me. A lot of other people did the same. But about the time the Berlin Wall opened, then there's a huge wave of people, even more than that. So millions and millions of people coming over to our side. So I had hundreds of conversations with all of these people. And they told me what their lives had been like. They told me about their fears. They told me about the terror of the Stasi or the KGB persecuting them. They told me what their life had been like under this repressive, cruel, totalitarian government. I didn't understand that part of communism until I had listened to the people who had lived in it. So a few months into this project, then God, with the same clarity, says, all right, now go tell the stories of my faithful people who stayed. And I'm thinking, right, I don't speak all of those languages, but it was like, go. So I got nudged out the door, and I went. I went to Poland, I went to Hungary, I went to people who are from Czechoslovakia, I went to East Germany, I went to Russia a number of times, and talked with people who had contributed to what ultimately was a peaceful revolution. The book that came out of that was Candles Behind the Wall. It was an interesting process getting these stories. So my interpreter in Moscow told me that she was third generation KGB. I'm thinking, great. This is when she brings a wire out and, kills me in the back seat of the car. I was worried about getting the tape cassettes where all the interviews, getting them out of the country. The law was a little fluid at this time in the Wild East. So I stuffed them into my suitcase and I prayed, okay, Lord, you have made blind eyes see, now make seeing eyes blind. So the customs agent opens my suitcase, rummages around, jumps on a little jewel box, just a few pieces of jewelry, says, aha, we have caught you smuggling. Opens it up and chews it and bangs it on, realizes it's just costume jewelry, nothing valuable. So in disgust, he flings it back in the suitcase and waves me through. That worked so well, I did that every single trip. And every time, it's a different guy who falls for the same thing. It was wonderful. So after several hundred conversations with people from the East Bloc, I discovered that this was a revolution of the spirit. That didn't fit through my grid at all. Economics, politics, right? It doesn't fit. And I couldn't have seen it unless I had seen the people who had lived it. Now, at that time, everybody is reporting Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and Mikhail Gorbachev. Those were the heroes in this story. Later, a few of them added in the Pope. But at this time, nobody was looking at this other dimension, this revolution of the spirit, but at the grassroots level. There were people there who, because of their faith in God, were willing to stand up and simply burn with the truth, burn with their faith. They were like candles. Their light, the light of their convictions, would then ignite somebody else and give them the courage to stand up too. And as one candle lit another, the darkness began to recede. I discovered that this was a conflict in the realm of the spirit. I couldn't have seen it before, and I nearly missed it. Almost everybody else missed it too. But I discovered that there were amazing, courageous people who, at a moment of crisis, simply stood up. So, example like Shira Naidosova. So during the attempted coup in Russia in 1991, the tanks are rolling into Moscow, and the fledgling democracy is in their White House, the building where the parliament met, and the tanks are rolling up. She goes up to one of the tanks and bangs on the side of it. Bam, 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 bam. And the driver of the tank pops at the top of it. What? She hands him a Bible. And she says, it says here not to kill. Are you going to kill me? And she puts herself right in front of his tank. Well, no, at that moment he wasn't going to kill her. He hadn't thought about it in that way, that it was going to be a real person saying, don't do this. But he took the Bible. Most people had not even seen one. She joined a number of people, 4 of them that I talked to, who took a shipment of Bibles they had just gotten the night before from the American Bible Society. Go figure. They loaded up crates, and all of them spread out and gave Bibles to the tank drivers, one at a time, and engaged them in a conversation and begged them not to shoot their people, their own people. And in the end, those tank drivers refused the orders to roll over these people who would then form a human chain all around the White House. I discovered that in every country there was a core of people who, because of their convictions, wanted change. They wanted a peaceful revolution, though, and they vowed not to return evil with evil. And as they spoke the truth of Christ into what Solzhenitsyn called the culture of the lie, the darkness receded. Let me tell you about another one of these candles that I discovered. Rüdiger Knechtel was a border guard in East Germany, right after the Berlin Wall was built in 1961. The next year, the first person was shot trying to get across it. So Rüdiger is stationed right there on that spot where that person had been shot. And people could see across from the western side, so they'd yell over to him, hey, did you shoot him? And he'd look around and he'd go, no, I wouldn't shoot him. But he had to think about that. Would he actually shoot one of his countrymen trying to make a break to go over to freedom in the West? And he wrestled with himself and finally decided, no, I'm not going to shoot my countrymen. So he talks to the other guys in his unit. They're all 19 years old, right? They all got drafted. And they had this conversation and finally said, no, this is wrong. So they agreed that they are all going to shoot to miss or just not shoot at all. Well, he thinks this is such a splendid idea that he puts a note in a milk bottle, tosses it across the side to the west, asking them to drop leaflets all along the border, asking all of the East German soldiers not to shoot. Well, that did not go unnoticed. The authorities came, picked him up, picked up the other men in his company. All of them got a kind of a mock trial, and they all went to prison for 2 years. Rüdiger, in that time, had a wife who was being visited by the Stasi, who convinced her to divorce him while he's in prison. They told his son that his father was a criminal, a terrible man, he should never have anything to do with him. So when Rüdiger gets out 2 years later, he's lost his wife and his son, the 2 people who mattered most to him, and he has nothing. The price of doing the right thing was sometimes very high. I'll put this here. There were people like Rudiger all over the East Bloc countries who simply at a moment of crisis stood up. Sometimes there were a lot of them. There were rebellions in East Germany and Poland in 1954, in Hungary in 1956, and in Czechoslovakia in 1968. And every one of them ended with tanks and bullets and thousands of people being put in prison. President Reagan resisted communism with every fiber of his being. Thank you, Brad, for the things that you said about him. He threw down the gauntlet and said early in his presidency that communism would end on the ash heap of history. He resisted communism at three levels, the military, the political, but also the moral and spiritual. He knew that America needed to bargain from a position of strength, so he authorized the expenditures for weapons, but he also negotiated arms reduction. He had, however, a real sense of the moral aspect of communism, and when he called it the evil empire, all the sophisticated Europeans kind of laughed. The dissidents who were in prison in Russia cheered when they heard him say that because they knew that he was absolutely speaking the truth. And they particularly loved it when he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." People on both sides of it cheered that day. Let me tell you about another one of my favorite candles who cheered for Reagan that day. Alexander Ogorodnikov was a student of cinematography, and when he was making a film about Christians who worshiped in the woods so they would not be persecuted by the KGB, he got tossed out of the university because that was an unacceptable subject for a Soviet university. He started a group called the Christian Seminar. He gathered a number of Russian Orthodox intellectuals, and they together wanted to live their faith authentically. They really resented the fact that the Orthodox Church had been capped in what it was able to do in terms of bringing their faith into the society. Alexander said it was like having to leave your faith like a piece of luggage at the door of the church when you walked out. Charitable works were forbidden. Going into prisons as a chaplain was forbidden. All of the kinds of things that we take for granted, educating children in the faith, all of those were forbidden. Well, Alexander and those in the Christian Seminar wanted to change that. So he goes from city to city encouraging people, and of course the KGB begins to take an interest in him. And they told him to stop, and he said, "I will not." So he learns spycraft. He goes underground, and he teaches the other leaders of the Christian Seminar as well. So they learn to slip a letter with a deft move under a cushion, or put a slash of lipstick on a wall to indicate a pickup point for things. They learned really to communicate with each other in different cities like spies do, except, oh, they're spies for the Lord. Wonderful. He had this kind of ebullient personality that simply would not take no for an answer. And when the KGB told him they would give him a passport to leave for Switzerland, just shut up and get out, they said, he said no. So he met with his friends. They debated this back and forth and said, "No, you need to leave." And he said, "I must live my faith with my flesh and blood as a witness for Christ. Pardon me for these lofty words, but I must do this for him." Well, they had tears rolling down their face because they knew what this meant. The KGB did, in fact, pick him up. They put him in prison where he was beaten, where he was starved, where they put him into a freezing prison cell with very little clothing. He was so hungry at one point, he said he had hallucinations of plucking his eyeballs out and eating them. When he would pray, the prison guards would scream at him not to, and then he would continue praying. So they pumped human excrement into his prison cell, so he had nowhere to lie down to sleep. One day, Alexander had been transported to a prison across the way on the eastern side of the Soviet Union, and he wore a cross, and one of the prison guards wanted to make an example of him. So 2,000 prisoners are called out into their yard, and this prison guard calls him up and says, "You, come here." He says, "Take off your cross." And Alexander says very politely, "No, this is the symbol of my faith, and I must obey the Lord more than man." And the guard says, "Take off your cross." And he smacks him across the face. And Alexander says, "I am no one, but I am a son of the Lord, and he will not be humiliated. So if you are against me, you are against him. I warn you." So with that, the guard began beating him, raining down blows. Alexander hangs onto the cross. Well, they dragged him off into a cell block where 5 men then began hailing down blows on him. And as he is praying out loud, the guard that had started this with him says, "You don't pray to your Lord, you pray to me. I am your Lord." Unable to get this cross any other way, Alexander at this point puts it in his mouth. They're pounding him. They then sprayed a kind of a spray in the room to get him to choke it out. They hadn't thought about the fact that they were in that room too, so pretty soon they're all choking. He hangs on to the cross. They decided then they would put handcuffs on him, so they did, and threw him down to the ground and jumped on his wrists with their full body force, again and again. He passed out from the pain. He woke up in his prison cell a few hours later. Cross is gone. His arms are swollen. He can't even feel anything in his hands. And some prisoners 2 cells down knew what had happened. They'd all seen it. One of them decided that they would do something about it. So he takes off his sock, although it was very cold, and unravels the yarn, and then begins to fashion a small cross, making knots, little tiny knots, until it finally makes a cross. So he took a tube of paper, and he puts it inside there, and then he uses the construction of the prison cells to his advantage. He gets on the shoulders of 2 of the other prisoners, puts the cross in the tube, stands up and blows it like a blow dart. It goes through the opening above the rooms, right through the thing where the electric wires go, and right down into his lap. He had been without his cross exactly 3 hours. Now, the prison guard who had started this whole thing with Alexander is suddenly stricken ill. He was a very buff man who was very proud of his physique, and suddenly he had an ailment that nobody in the infirmary could cure. They took him to Moscow. They couldn't cure him there. So 2 months later, Alexander hears the sounds of a military dirge as they are carrying the coffin by of this guard who had said, "You pray to me, I am your Lord." After that, Alexander said, none of the prison's guards touched him. The Soviet Union tried to impose its rule with fear and terror. They threatened critics with prison or death, and that's why I am so surprised to hear that so many young people today are thinking that socialism or communism would be a good thing for America. They really need to look at the record, where it's been put into practice. Communism only works with force. That's the part that young people today need to know. The history of socialism and communism is written in blood. Whittaker Chambers was a communist, but he had a change of heart, and he emerged to tell his story in a book called Witness. I really recommend it. If you'd like to read that, find out about it. Anybody who thinks America needs communism should see what he said. He said there are 2 faiths that have been on trial in the 20th century, faith in God and faith in man. Communism is a vision of man without God. Anatoly Rudenko was a brilliant student of economics at a Russian university. He was told to join the Komsomol. It's a group for young people, students. The only problem is you have to swear allegiance to the Communist Party, and Anatoly had become a Christian, so he said he could not. Now, he wasn't just a Christian, He was a Baptist, and that was being like a cockroach in Russia. No kidding. I mean, they had no sense of humor about Baptists whatsoever. I can say that because I work at a Baptist university. Come on. He decided that it was worth being booted out of the university to hold true to his faith. So he goes to another university, way on the other side of Russia. He's a great student, does very well. The same thing. They say, you've got to join the Komsomol. And he said, no. And he realized at this point it was futile, so he said, all right, I will get up on a public stage and give my reasons and explain my faith and why I can't do this. So he did, and he knew he had no chance of ever getting an education after that, so he goes back home to his hometown. He repairs refrigerators and kind of ekes out a living. Well, one day there comes knock, knock, knock at his door. KGB showed up and hauled him away to a Soviet psychiatric prison. Why a psychiatric prison, you might ask? Because their reasoning was this: if somebody has been raised in a communist system and they have learned Marxism and atheism from the time they are 5 years old, if they don't believe it, they must be insane. There's no other explanation. So these Soviet psychiatric prisons were to take sane people and essentially make them insane. He walked into this place and saw people rolling imaginary balls. Some were drooling. Some had been tied to beds and were there lying in their own excrement. Some people were injected with a substance that would raise the body temperature to 105 degrees very quickly, which, by the way, will fry your brain. He looked at all of this and was terrified, and he prayed. And the only reason he could tell me this story is that the Baptists in Russia contacted the Baptist Union in America, who in turn contacted President Reagan, who in turn contacted Mikhail Gorbachev, and he was released. A lot of other people were not as fortunate. The communists did everything in their power to silence people of faith. That's why it was so surprising that they permitted the visit of John Paul II to Poland in 1979. When he came there, his visit literally would change the course of history. George Weigel's biography, Witness to Hope, is a wonderful, long rendition of his life. When he appeared there, he's on this huge stage, a 50-foot cross. 1 million people had packed into every near street, so he addresses all of them. Edward Gierek, the Polish premier, is in a hotel room overlooking the square, looking at this kind of nervously. I mean, what's he going to say? What can he say? When Pope John Paul II spoke, it was not a political message at all. What he did was remind people who they were. They were children of God, created in his image, with rights and duties and responsibilities, but also a particular case, a particular place in history. And he asked them, are we capable of this? Are we capable of living this responsibly? And as people recognize what he's saying, they begin to applaud. There's a spatter. Then there's more, and they realize this is the affirmation of their faith. They can say it this way. So the applause builds and builds. 14 minutes. People are speaking their faith for the first time in 40 years, and they grew stronger with every clap. He sees this and realizes this is a moment for teaching. So he emphasized again and again over the next 9 days, do this responsibly. Do what you do with dignity, live with restraint. And in his message, they would transcend communism. Of course, that made him a target for the Soviet Union. May 13th, 1981, in St. Peter's Square, a Bulgarian assassin shot 5 bullets at him. Investigations since have concluded that the KGB must have ordered that assassination attempt. 2 former CIA directors are on record of that, and also an Italian investigation. There were people who were endangered all over the East Bloc. There were spark plugs in different cities. One of them in East Germany was in Leipzig. It was a Lutheran pastor there, Christian Führer. He was one of the Candles who had begun a prayer group in 1983 Every Monday, they would meet at 5 o'clock in the Nikolaikirche to pray for peaceful change in their country. Well, that seems innocuous enough. So sometimes there are 5 people, sometimes there are 50, but year after year, every Monday. Well, about 1989, it begins to heat up a little bit. Now, at this point, any organization you had is penetrated with people from the Stasi. So in a group like this, maybe a third of you would have a tape recorder in your pocket, right? But nobody would know who's who. And I would get arrested at the end of it and thrown in jail, and that's how they work, right? So at this event, Christian Führer knows that there are people there, so you have to plan the revolution, if you will, with the enemy in the room. The group gets bigger and bigger, so over the course of '89, after Tiananmen Square, it was clear there was nothing inevitable about peaceful change. The summer gets hotter. More people are beginning to come on the streets, and pretty soon it's 1,000, pretty soon it's 5,000. Well, at this point, the East Germans are really seriously worried. This was about to get out of control. So they put a notice in the newspaper in Leipzig on October 7th, 8th. Not that it matters. Anyway, they said, this insurrection must be put down, and it will, if necessary, with a gun in the hand. They were threatening to use bullets to stop the people who were going to pray for peace. This group of people was very resolute. And on October 9th, Leipzig looked like a war zone. They brought in tanks around the entire center of the city. They flew in thousands of troops in riot gear. They had water cannons, attack dogs, tear gas. All these young recruits had been brought in, and they told them, you will obey an order to shoot, even if you have relatives and friends out there. Even if you have a mother or a sister, you will obey the order to shoot, or you will be shot from behind. Well, these young recruits go back to their barracks and throw themselves down and weep, because they did have sisters and mothers who were going to be out in that group. Nevertheless, as the day goes on, they have flown in hundreds of pints of blood to treat the expected shooting victims. They've warned parents to pick up their children because there will be violence, and it looked for everyone's eyes as though the city was about to break into a civil war. Everyone was afraid. Christian Führer was getting calls all afternoon saying, stop, this is going to end in bloodshed, and you're going to be the person who is responsible for it. In the meantime, thousands of people are on the streets of Leipzig, ashen-faced, really seriously worried, legitimately worried. 70,000 people that evening came all through the streets of Leipzig. All the churches were filled to overflowing, and everybody was terrified. Christian Führer began it on time, and he told them, blessed are the peacemakers. They began with a story that told people of peace having an effect and facing down the enemy. And as they are talking to the people there, they're thinking, oh my God, I'm not born to be a martyr, am I? And he addresses that. He said, not everyone is. But for those of you who go out into the street, do know that you may have the future of your country in your hand, depending on the way you respond tonight. And then he said something interesting happened. As he gave the blessing, the benediction for people to go, he said it was like the time that the Holy Spirit fell on the family of Cornelius in the book of Acts. The Spirit of the Holy Spirit fell and enveloped people there and gave them a sense of purpose and peace. They grabbed each other's elbows. They walked out carrying nothing but a small candle, and they looked at those troops outside, and instead of hating them, they smiled. 70,000 people that evening walked between these walls of soldiers on both sides, peacefully around the ring of Leipzig. 70,000 people. If anybody took up a stone to throw it through a window, someone else took it out and put it down. 70,000 people who peacefully marched around the ring that night. No one gave those troops a reason to shoot. Not one person threw a rock through a window. Not one person knocked off the cap of one of those soldiers. And at the end of the evening, the forces of peace had won. The news got out of this, and it spread all over East Germany. And people began to do this in other cities as well. And by the time it gets to Berlin, 1 million people go out onto the streets. But disciplined, they did not give a provocation to shoot. At this point, the East German leaders realized he had totally lost control. Erich Honecker resigns. The people were speaking with their feet, and they were negotiating with the signs that they were carrying. On November 9th in Leipzig, as 1 million people are on their feet in Berlin, this time in Leipzig, they do a march to commemorate Kristallnacht, the night of violence against the Jews at the beginning of the Second World War. And as they march through the streets of Leipzig for the 7th time, they ask forgiveness for what the Germans had done to the Jews in the Second World War. And as they march through Leipzig for the 7th time, the wall in Berlin fell with an echo of that of Jericho. You could say that that was a natural outcome, or you could simply accept that this was miraculous. Nobody expected it. And the border guards in Berlin simply opened up the barriers, and nobody had the will to stop the river of people crossing. Using a little poetic license, you could say that what took 10 years in Poland took 10 months in Hungary, and 10 weeks in Germany, and 10 days in Czechoslovakia, and 10 hours in Romania. But this rolling earthquake, a spiritual and moral earthquake, rumbled across the continent, finally taking down the Soviet Union in the last throes in 1991. As history goes, this is not normally the way revolutions roll out. December of 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev handed in his resignation. 400 million people had been freed, and scarcely a shot was fired. 2 more thoughts. Václav Havel, Czechoslovakia's leader, said he thought he was an agnostic, but in his New Year's Eve address in 1989, he said he had to believe in miracles because he had just lived one. He had been in prison 6 months before as a dissident playwright. Now he was a president of Czechoslovakia. 1989 truly was the Annus Mirabilis, the year of miracles. 30 years later, the culture that we are living in now is increasingly confrontational. No one knows how this will end. I do know that we need new candles. And I challenge the students who are here today, we need you. We need your principled and mature behavior. We need your thoughtfulness. We need your faith. And you need to be able to stand for the truth and burn, regardless of the consequences. And if you do, the darkness will recede. I'll leave you with one last image. The formation of character takes place in the crucible of conflict. Human character is like the formation of coal. It's formed under massive pressure, deep in the earth, over eons of time. It produces 2 things, either dust or diamonds. Thank you.